Okay, so welcome back. Like I said, again, my name is Callie Foster, and I am your host for CBI. Today, we are on our third session with Andrea Vernon. Andrea, would you mind sharing your screen at this time?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay. So I arranged for Andrea to do her own introduction, but I just wanted to say she is the executive director here at Montana Campus Compact, so I have the pleasure of working with her every day. We are excited to have her. Go ahead, Andrea, whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Thank you, Callie. I'm excited to be here with all of you today to talk about community stakeholders and how we identify and work with community stakeholders, how we can engage new stakeholders and potentially create a plan to manage these stakeholders. So that's going to be our topic for the day. And want to just welcome you all to the series, and I can explain a little bit about who I am. As Callie said, I'm Andrea Vernon. I'm the Executive Director of Montana Campus Compact, headquartered in Missoula at the University of Montana. And I've been doing work with Campus Compact and community engagement within higher education for the past 25 years. So I've been doing this work a long time, primarily here at the University of Montana, and then more recently in the past 5 years, working statewide with our colleges and universities and really helping to support their community engagement initiatives and missions. And a lot of that revolves around stakeholder development. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience to the table to share with you all, and try to make this as interactive as possible, which is always a little challenging with the online environment. But using our chat box, I think, is a really great way to be able to get involved with some interactive participation. So, in fact, I need to pull up my chat box. Trying to find that here. All right, I might have to get some help with the chat box at some point. Oh no, maybe here we go. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Now I can see the chat box. Okay, so with that, we will go ahead and get started. I think we still have a few people that are joining us. So hopefully you can all hear me all right, and we'll go ahead and get started with the slideshow. Figure out how to get that next slide going here. There we go. Okay, so our agenda for the day is to, first of all, talk about stakeholders and boil it down a little bit more specifically to who our stakeholders are, why they're important for our organizations and for the collaborations or committees that we're working with. And then we'll take a more specific look at what some of the roles and functions of our stakeholder groups are, and then create some opportunities to talk about tools to develop, to educate, engage, and really help our stakeholders become advocates for the work that we're involved in. Because ultimately that's sort of a goal that we have for working with other partners within our communities or regions to support the kind of work that we're doing, is to become our advocates and help us to meet our missions. So the goals for our session then are to understand our stakeholders better and to build out some communication strategies to work with those stakeholders. All right. So let's talk more, or start off, I guess, by defining what a stakeholder is so that we have a common understanding of what that term means. The formal definition of a stakeholder is any person or group or organization that can place some sort of claim or value on an organization's attention, their resources, or the output that may be affected by that, by the work of that organization. And so it's basically people who are playing a role with the organization to help it achieve its goals and objectives. And stakeholders have specific needs and expectations that can be either internal or external to the organization or the program that you're working with. So if we look at the slide here, this is kind of a basic set of examples of who our typical stakeholders might be in our community. So first of all, our clients or the customers, who are the people that we are primarily serving through the programs and services of the organization that we're working with. Definitely funders, donors, grantors, those are important stakeholder groups because they oftentimes control the purse strings for the organization or have some influence over how money is spent within an organization. The employees are certainly important stakeholders, and sometimes we overlook that fact that people who are employed at the organization have a lot at stake for the success of the programs. People who serve on the boards of directors for nonprofit organizations are important stakeholders, as well as our volunteers. Other nonprofit organizations, so partner organizations that you reach out to and collaborate with are considered as stakeholders. And this is kind of an interesting one too, the banks or other financial entities that might hold mortgages or loans. A lot of times organizations take out lines of credit or have loans in order to help them make ends meet. And so certainly those loan holders are part of a group of stakeholders. Suppliers kind of refers to those either businesses, government, or other nonprofit entities that may be important suppliers. For example, in a food bank system, who are the suppliers of food? Is it local grocery stores where you're gleaning food or being able to accept donations, that type of thing. So suppliers of goods and as well as services can be considered a group of stakeholders as well. So with that in mind, the list itself is kind of broad. But I think it's important to look at who your stakeholders are from a broad context because it really helps to begin to identify some of the intricate webs of relationships that our organizations hold within communities and how those relationships might have influence, again, whether it's internal or external to the organization itself. So it's a bit of a way of understanding the external environment, the market that your organization is serving in, where it exists and how it operates. So having a broad perspective of these stakeholders also helps to kind of stay in check, have an organization stay in check with, its sole mission and purpose. And so understanding from a broad context who these stakeholders are really helps organizations to stay aligned with their mission and with the goals and objectives that they have. I think it's important for organizations to continuously clarify who they are, what they're there for, what's their purpose, what is their mission, what guides their programming and services, because that's really the basis of the social contract that we have with nonprofit organizations and other public service organizations like our education institutions. That public service contract that really relies heavily on those charitable purposes, those philanthropic purposes that we have for our organizations in communities. And so keeping a broader sense of stakeholder groups, I think, helps hold organizations more accountable to their mission. So this is our first chance to have some interaction. So our first chat question here is going to be, I'm interested in hearing from all of you about who your current stakeholders are, if they represent this list, or if you have some ideas or examples of stakeholders that aren't really encompassed with this particular group. So start to maybe just list out who your stakeholder groups are, who have you interacted with so far in your service work. I realize some of you are maybe at the very beginning of your service experience, and some of you may be mid-year or starting to look at wrapping up your service year. So everybody's at a different stage of their the service work, but I think at this stage, hopefully you've had some interaction with stakeholders. So who are those stakeholders that you've interacted with so far? And any other stakeholder groups that maybe aren't represented in the list so far. So looking at our chat box, be sure you have your chat box open if you don't already. So click on that and then you can see people putting in their their ideas here. So one stakeholder group, Glacier National Park, the Forest Service, Tribal Council, that's great. All the bullet points listed. Let's see, statewide college students, traditional and non-traditional students, AmeriCorps members, our advisory committees, great. Eastern Montana veterans, great. Let's see, the ones listed, students for sure, good. Boys and Girls Club, local school systems, it's a great addition to this list. Students, faculty, staff, veterans organizations in the community, steering council, program leaders, fiscal sponsor, that's another important stakeholder, one of those kind of like a loan or a financial institution. Parks Foundation, so foundations, volunteers, community partners, good. Very active friends group for my park, so they must be doing some fundraising and volunteering, that's great. BIA, I'm assuming that's Bureau of Indian Affairs, the general public, schools, teachers, commissioners, so yeah, county commissioners, local lawmakers, city council folks, legislators in some aspects might become stakeholders during, especially right now, during the Montana legislative session that only happens every 2 years in Montana. Legislators can be really important stakeholders. Grocery stores, farmers, clients, volunteers, the city, yeah, so getting into those policymakers is really important too. Great. Well, thank you. That's a really good list to add to what we've already talked about. Especially appreciate, looking at those funding groups and those different levels of policymakers at the city council, the county commissioners, and the state legislative aspects. So that's great to understand, hopefully a little bit more, get you thinking along those lines of, yeah, who are our stakeholders? Because that's going to be the basis of how we move through the session this morning. So let me see if I can get the next slide going here. My system is very delayed. All right. On the right slide. Okay. So looking at how then stakeholders might influence our organizations is kind of where we're going to go here. And we had a good segue with that, with the examples of stakeholders that you all listed. So being aware of and analyzing various stakeholder groups is a really important exercise to understand the networks and the politics that surround an organization in the community. These can be either actual relationships or partnerships or potential partnerships that you hope to build out through a strategic planning aspect or through some guided efforts to create new groupings of stakeholders. So it's really helpful to kind of understand this organizational context because it can give you valuable clues to identifying some of the types of communication strategies that you want to use to communicate with your current or potential stakeholder groups, how you want to potentially develop shared programming or collaborative programming, or even come together for funding opportunities. So definitely stakeholders hold a lot of different types of influence over groups. One that we'll start with here is sort of this political aspect of it. And understanding really kind of the level of the sphere of influence is what I call it. So the sphere of influence is another sort of screening tool that you can use with your stakeholder groups to understand which stakeholders have what kind of influence over our organization. And so do they have political influence, financial influence? Do they have the ability to help us network and reach other potential partners? Or do they have influence over how effective our organization is at meeting our goals and serving our mission? Silence that, sorry. So starting with political then, as we talked about with the local city council, the mayor, city leaders, county commissioners, It's important to really be able to connect with those folks to help them understand what your organization is doing, and so that when they're making decisions at a city or county level that might impact the kinds of programs and services or funding, even if you receive some funding from these groups, that's going to be a really important aspect. Understanding then how these stakeholders have financial sway or can help you build out other partnerships is really going to help you prioritize the way in which you work with your stakeholders. And I think this type of analysis of figuring out the kind of influence that each stakeholder group has with your organization, it can help you with strategic planning if your organization is either in the process of or operating underneath a current strategic plan. It's important as you're going back and doing your checks and balances with strategic planning to be able to continuously identify the ways in which your stakeholder groups have influence, because sometimes those stakeholder groups' influence will change. And it's important to be sort of mindful of that so that you can be more proactive about how those changes might influence the kind of work that you're doing with them. So I want to be able to transition here a bit and get into another aspect of chat questions. So I want to find out from you all if you've seen the influence of some of these stakeholder groups that you've identified earlier. Have you seen the influence of these stakeholders at your organization already? And if you could give me an example or two of how that influence has either helped in your mind or hindered the progress of your programs and services. So this is looking at again, how these stakeholders have influenced your organization. So maybe pick one example if you can think of a specific way that a stakeholder has had either positive or negative or challenging influences for the organization. So let's get some examples flowing again in that chat box. Give you some time to think a minute. All right, so one stakeholder helped to begin to create quality standards for the after-school program. So maybe if you could identify who that stakeholder was it parents, was it teachers, was it, were they other after-school programming partners that you work with? So that's a great example of how a stakeholder has influenced the organization by helping you create these quality standards. But maybe let us know who that was. Yeah. Okay, another example at Makoshuka Park. The Friends of the Park group's done a lot to help us plan, fundraise, and advertise the 30th annual Buzzard Day celebration. That sounds like a fun day to celebrate buzzards. All right, good. Let me get back up here and take a look at some of these others. Board members stepped up to help with daily operations after the director quit. That's a pretty critical aspect of engaging that stakeholder group to help the organization continue to function. It's a really good, important example. A lot of multiple program leaders came together in a focus group. So hopefully the results of that focus group helped to inform program models or what your organization is doing. Let's see. Helping local watershed organizations collaborate with homeowners, so helping you create some collaborations. Piloted a youth learning garden program, received feedback from youth at the end of the programming to improve for the future. So you were able to use your youth as an important stakeholder group to provide good data for program improvement. That's great. It's a very good way to help empower those youth to have use their voice to make change. It's awesome. Let's see, HRDC, we're working to reduce transportation barriers so more individuals can enter the workforce. You've invited local taxi companies to be part of the Transportation Advisory Committee. They've ignored all of your invitations. They won't collaborate. Okay, so it's been a big hindrance to effort. So that's a good example. If you think about sort of what the motivations are there, sometimes when stakeholders do come in and create interference or challenges or barriers to what you're trying to do, you might want to take a look at their motivations. You know, is this coming out of a sense of competition that they might lose business? If this is a taxi company, I'm making the assumption that it's some type of a business, so they would potentially see this as a threat to their their ability to have customers, paying customers. But it might be interesting to find out if there's a way that you can reach out and understand what their, why they don't want to collaborate. We'll get into this a little bit later on, but you have to kind of weigh, you have to kind of measure and balance how much effort you put into certain stakeholder groups, because sometimes they can really sap the energy and the capacity of organizations if you're spending too much time appeasing or trying to carry on or trying to create some sort of continuing partnership with partners that aren't very willing to do that. So that's an important example. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so those are some good, let's see, one more. Volunteers are vital to the daily operations of keeping the visitor center going. So another good stakeholder group. Organization was started by local community members. Everything we do relies heavily on volunteers on our board. So that's great. It's good to see the ways that these stakeholders are asserting positive influence, and I'm thankful to see that challenging situation as well. All right, well, let's look now more deeply at the roles and the functions of these different stakeholder groups. So first of all, obviously, like many of you have noted in the examples here, they support the organization financially. So these are going to be your funders, your donors, other organizations that you partner with to share some sort of financial responsibility for programming and services. Let's see, providing input and direction on programming and services. So that example of having the youth be able to give feedback about what they liked or didn't like about a program. So that's going to be a really valuable role and function of a stakeholder group. This one is helping to understand the scope of the problem in your community. So that's where a lot of these organizations or stakeholder groups rather can really help to ascertain the direction of your programming, especially if you're looking at big shifts in either availability of funding or new organizations coming into the community that are doing similar kinds of things. There's important ways that you need to really work with those stakeholder groups to understand the scope of the problem and who will take on, which organizations or collaborations between organizations will take on certain aspects of that problem. And that ties into building connections with other entities that are doing similar work. In Montana, as many of you have probably experienced, we are often operating with a minimum level of resources, whether that's financial resources or human capacity resources. So it's really important that we can create efficiencies through our stakeholder groups to really be able to identify which programs are going to be focusing on what. One example of that might be efforts to reduce homeless populations within communities. I know here in Missoula we've had a very big effort through our plan to end homelessness in 10 years, and we're about probably 7 or 8 years into that plan now. A big part of the beginning aspects of that plan was really helping or having organizations identify their specific role in solving that problem, and then utilizing or funneling resources to those specific organizations that had that very narrowly defined role, so that there wasn't a lot of competition or overlap or duplication of services. That really reduces the efficiency of how we're able to use our financial and human resource capacity to the best of our abilities. So I think that's a big function of stakeholder groups, is really helping to align work so that we're utilizing our resources in the most efficient and effective ways possible. And of course, doing the work with you, helping you to be able to build out better and bigger ways of tackling some of these complex social problems that are facing our communities and that a lot of your service revolves around. Okay, so this next question about stakeholders, if you can think about boiling it down, if you were to create a hierarchy of stakeholders within your organization that you're familiar with, who would you place, which stakeholder group would you place at the top of that hierarchy as the most important stakeholder group that helps you achieve your goals and objectives and helps your organization or your program specifically to be effective? So maybe volunteers. Absolutely, that's a good Good response. Who else is at the top of that hierarchy group of stakeholders? Volunteers, local ranchers, okay. College president, yeah, that person holds a lot of sway. State government, okay, provides substantial funding, so a funder, yep. The state, local water district. So are those in relation to funding or program direction? Those would be interesting things. Donors, boards of directors, yep. The CEO of organizations, yeah, so organizational leaders are really important as a stakeholder group for capturing effectiveness. Okay, any other examples of those top stakeholder groups? Okay, well, that was a good set. A lot of them revolve around funding, of course, and also sort of the base of people who are getting the work done, the volunteers in particular. So thanks for those examples. The next thing we kind of want to look at now is sort of the fact that organizations or stakeholder groups within organizations can really change throughout the life cycle of a project or a particular program. So in the beginning, a stakeholder group like a donor might really help to provide that base level of funding or support for a program. And that same person then may turn into a volunteer that actually volunteers and becomes part of the human resource capacity to carry out programming. Or potentially that donor could turn into a member of your board of directors as well and really help with that overall governance and vision and path of the organization. So that's a kind of basic example, but it's really meant to just help you understand that once you have stakeholder groups in a sort of identified as in a specific role or function within your organization, it's important to go back and not just pigeonhole that group into that category for the lifetime of that stakeholder's involvement, because those roles and functions definitely evolve over time as programs change, as staffing within organizations change, leadership of organizations change. Those stakeholder groups can really change and fluctuate in the specific roles and kind of how you need to be communicating with them. So that being said, continuous and incremental analysis of your stakeholder groups is really important, especially at times of change within organizations. So to kind of help you do that, the next slide here is this matrix. And so now that we have some definition and parameters around who our stakeholder groups are, we'll kind of do this exercise to be able to figure out where we need to place these stakeholders now on this matrix. And so I'll explain the matrix here in a little bit. So we've got, on this side over here, we've got their level of power over the organization. So do these stakeholders hold high power? So if they do, they're going to be up in this upper quadrant. If that stakeholder group has a relatively low power over the organization, we're going to put them into this bottom quadrant. So this is the power axis on our matrix. Down below here on this other axis, we have our level of interest. So how interested are these stakeholders within your organization? How interested are these stakeholders in your organization? Do they have high levels of interest? And they're going to be in this quadrant to the right. If they have a low level of interest, they're going to be in this quadrant to the left. So that is our axis here. And then within the quadrant itself, the matrix itself, we have this quadrant. So these are stakeholders that have high power but low level of interest. So we kind of want to keep them, these types of stakeholders, we want to keep them satisfied because they yield power over the organization, but they're not super interested or active with the organization. So we're going to keep them satisfied if they have that high power. If they have low power and low level of interest, we're more in a stage of sort of monitoring this, this kind of relationship. Not investing a lot of time, but still keeping track of it. Let me see, it looks like there was a question in the audio. Okay, hopefully everybody's able to hear me all right. Okay, looks like somebody's maybe joining in from the phone. Okay, so that's this side of the matrix and figuring out where you're going to place certain stakeholder groups. Let's look at the other side now. So we're looking at these are, let's start down here actually. So we've got this group of stakeholders, which would be people that have high levels of interest in your organization, but maybe lower levels of power. So we want to really keep these stakeholder groups informed about what the organization is doing. And then up here is where we're going to see probably the most level of work, I guess, on the part of the organization to keep these stakeholder groups satisfied, because these stakeholders have high interest in your organization and high influence. They hold a lot of power over these, over your organization. So a little group exercise we can try to do in the chat box is to kind of see where you would place some of your stakeholder groups. So again, if you pick out one or two of your top stakeholder groups, so these, you know, on that hierarchy, maybe think of a organization or stakeholder group rather that's at the top of that hierarchy and one that's maybe at the middle or bottom of the hierarchy. Where would you place them on this matrix? And so I'll give you a couple of examples while you're thinking of that, and as you start to put some ideas into the chat box. So up here in the Keep Satisfied quadrant, these might be employees of the organization. They might be donors or clients served within the organization. Down here in the Monitor, this might be your suppliers. This might be your lending agencies, things like that. Over here in the Keep Informed category, these might be your volunteers. They're very interested in your organization. They're obviously interested, otherwise they wouldn't be volunteering their time, but they may not have a lot of power over decision-making within your organization, so you want to keep that group informed. And then this upper quadrant here would potentially include donors. It would include maybe other partner organizations. Might include parents if you're working with youth, if you have youth service programs, that type of thing. So those are just some examples to think about to get some ideas going. So if you want to put into the chat box, what you could do is maybe list the stakeholder, like volunteers, and where you would place them in, you know, in this matrix. Would you place them in the Keep Satisfied quadrant, the Monitor quadrant, the Keep Informed, or the Encourage and Influence?
Andrea, it looks like we have a question about the matrix. Kay said, what do the purple texts mean? Does it mean that we need to monitor them, or do they monitor an organization?
In this lower quadrant, that's what this kind of means that you want to just monitor their level of participation with your organization. You want to be able to make sure that they're maintaining involvement and they're not completely dropping off of, you know, your radar in terms of their role as a stakeholder group. So monitoring would kind of be this, probably the lowest level of interaction that you would have with a stakeholder group. But you need to recognize, you're recognizing that they're still, you know, they play an important role, so you need to just, so you can't forget them entirely. I'm not stating this very well. But you need to still maintain a level of communication. It might be stakeholders that you only communicate with maybe quarterly, on a quarterly basis, to provide them with updates about what you're doing. Or it might be, you know, it might be information that you can share with them through a newsletter or through a more low level, low touch, low impact kind of communication, okay? Hopefully that helps. Does it mean that we need to monitor them, or do they monitor? Yes, so it's referring more to how the organization monitors those stakeholders, not necessarily how the stakeholders are monitoring the organization. So hopefully that is clarifying there. So we have one participant that put their volunteers in the Monitor category to keep them informed. Volunteers keep informed, yep, so that sort of high interest, low level of power. Keep informed would be public and governing agencies, okay? Donors, definitely encourage and influence, yep. A lot of times those are the groups that you're gonna be spending a lot more time interacting with and making sure that they feel connected to your organization so that you can continue to encourage their participation. And in some cases going back to kind of that political aspect of influence. You know, a lot of time donors have connections to other decision makers within your community. So you want to use, you know, try to use them in the capacity of influencing decision makers within the community. All right, donors encourage and influence state administration, administer, keeping satisfied. Yeah, so with some of your funding organizations, that's the level you'll be at. You know, you're just going to want to keep them satisfied so that they know what's going on, but they don't require sort of that high touch level of engagement with you. Donors, boards of directors, encourage and influence. All right. So monitoring would be episodic volunteers. That's a good distinction because, yeah, there are ways that you can further classify the kinds of volunteers that you have. Do you have volunteers that are coming in once a quarter to help with a distribution project, or do you have volunteers that are showing up every week to really provide programming? And certainly with those episodic, less frequent volunteers, less engaged volunteers would be a monitor category, but those volunteers that are more reoccurring, like you said, you definitely want to keep them in the keep satisfied or keep informed. That's great. I'm glad for that, that opportunity to make that distinction. Landowners encourage and influence. So it sounds like they hold a lot of influence over your organization. So you'd want to make sure that you're maintaining high level of contact with them. All right. Community partners, encourage and influence, Parks Board, good. Okay, well, hopefully these examples are providing you with some good ways to really understand not only the importance of understanding who your stakeholders are, what roles they play, but how you can manage stakeholder groups. Because if you find that your organization has way too many stakeholders over here in this encourage and influence quadrant, you know, that's going to be directing a lot of organizational resources into maintaining those stakeholder groups. So one of the pieces that you can do internally within your organization is to help recategorize your stakeholder groups. So how do you, how do you move stakeholder groups from one area of that quadrant to another? Whether you have too many here, or if you have too many in this low interest and low power category, how do you start to think about who within that stakeholder group you want to move into other aspects of organizational connection with you so that they can be more productive and help your organization or program be more productive in what you're trying to do. So it kind of boils down to that, that importance of figuring out, are your stakeholders in the right places? Do you have too many stakeholders in that category where you're spending, a lot of your resources keeping them all happy? And what should your next steps be to help manage where those stakeholder groups are within that matrix? And what kinds of things you need to be doing to position your stakeholders differently if if you've run up against a hurdle, or if you kind of plateaued off on the kind of things that you're doing within programs. How can you, in order to get off that plateau and continue to see growth or progress, it might mean that you need to reanalyze your stakeholder groups and their roles and purposes with your organization, okay? So, moving forward then, let's see, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. Thanks for bringing that question to my attention, Callie. Okay, so now that you've got this kind of understanding of your stakeholder groups, the next piece is to really build that action or management plan and find out, really be able to focus on where you want to move your stakeholders. Once you have their attention and interest, how do you build their desire to be more engaged in your organization? And what's going to get what's going to pique their interest or their willingness to get involved and become active partners with your organization at that highest level of engagement. So kind of thinking about how you want to move stakeholders from maybe that lower quadrant up into that higher level of their ability to work with you to have power and influence over the problems and the issues that you're trying to address in your communities. So this is just another visual tool to kind of help you see that process of analyzing and assessing your stakeholder groups and their roles and purposes within your organization. Okay, so now with our last minutes here, time is always going too fast when we do these types of things. We're going to talk more about strategies to educate stakeholders so that you can help them become the best partners they can possibly be for the kinds of work that you're doing. So what we want to kind of focus on here is then, how do you align those stakeholders around a common vision to achieve the outcomes or the change or the impact that you want to see in the community? There's lots of different outreach efforts. Let me get on the right slide here, just a second. I think I'm a little bit behind. There's different types of efforts that we do. So let me scoot ahead because of time. So different strategies for educating stakeholders start with some of the basic forms, these written forms like our newsletters, our program or organizational websites, our annual reports of our organizations, evaluation or performance reports. Those are certainly important to our funding agencies, and sometimes they have really specific formats or protocols, especially if it's government funding. There's a lot of red tape that goes along with that funding, and so that's going to be an important way that you educate that particular stakeholder about what you're doing and how effective you are. More participatory types of educating stakeholders would be, these are just a few examples. So open forums, providing opportunities for your community to come into your organization and learn more about what you're doing. Maybe you're an organization that's tackling access to rivers and streams and water quality issues. So hosting open forums in your community where you can bring in experts who can talk about those types of things, and have your organization then share the kinds of strategies you're using to be able to maintain and build water quality and access to open, to rivers and streams. It's a really great way to educate stakeholders and to potentially draw in new stakeholders, because that's a big part of what education is about as well. Certainly, social media networks are important. I'm not a social media expert, and so there's a variety of ways, obviously, that organizations use social media or not to help educate current or future stakeholders within the organization. And then there's always traditional media. In Montana, we're fairly, small population state. It's really interesting to watch local news and see what's making news that day. My husband and I will often sometimes laugh a little bit with each other, like, wow, must be a slow news day. But that being said, we have good access to our traditional media sources like news outlets, newspapers, and so it's important not to overlook that. I think it's easy sometimes for us to think that social media is where it's all at, and that's what people are paying attention to. But a lot of people still pay attention to those traditional media sources. Holding individual meetings with people. So this would be, this would be more of a strategic approach where you identify people within your community that aren't currently involved or might be at that lower left-hand quadrant where they're low-level interest, low-level power, but you see the potential for them to have higher levels of interest and contributions to your organization. So you may want to identify specific individuals that you want to target as a stakeholder that needs some cultivation and development to move into more active stages of support for your organization. And so, setting up these individual meetings certainly takes more time and energy, but they often yield really high results. And so I really always like to talk about that as an option because, again, I think we can sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, where, it's easier to send out an email because you can reach lots of people within a pretty short period of time if you're emailing them out. Trying to inform and educate them about your organization and get them excited about being involved. That's a very different level of connection with individuals versus sitting down face to face, having coffee with somebody to just let them know, we think you might be interested in what you're doing, in what we're doing, and here's how we'd like to help you understand better and maybe give you some options for how you can increase your participation with our organization and become a more valued stakeholder. Holding public meetings and events, program trainings, those are all aspects of ways that you can engage people in more participatory ways to learn more about your organization and move them along that spectrum of stakeholder engagement. So I've been talking a long time. Let's move to a chat poll or chat question again. I'm interested in knowing what kinds of education or outreach that you've all done with some of your stakeholder groups that you found effective. So this is just a very basic list. Doesn't certainly not all inclusive of the ways in which you can educate and engage with stakeholders. So let's hear from some of you about what you found to be effective so far in reaching out and engaging with your stakeholders. Okay. Stakeholder meetings, roundtables, quarterly newsletter to keep up interest in our programming. Great. So large mail outs, emails, social media, interviews with newspapers, working with funders. So individual meetings are really important. Seeing the programs in process, answering questions, talking to parents when they come to pick up kids. That's a really good point of contact because, you know, they're in and they're out quickly. So if you can have a couple of very pointed questions that you want to ask, that's great. Social media, volunteer trainings, teacher trainings, news releases, radio. Yeah, there's lots of great local radio stations that have, you know, that are very welcoming to having local organizations come in and talk about what they're doing. Let's see, monthly meetings with advisory committee and AmeriCorps members. Those are great. Those are some really good examples that hopefully you're seeing some traction with and seeing people that are excited about the news that you're putting out. Let's see. All right. Getting close to our, let's see, engaging. Okay, so then once you have stakeholder, you know, have generated some interest among your stakeholders, either brand new ones or stakeholders that you see are interested in potentially moving to higher levels of engagement within the organization. It's important to be, you know, clear about inviting them. You know, saying we you know, are really excited that you're interested in our organization. We want to invite you to participate. These are the kinds of things we see that you could be really valuable in helping our organization achieve our mission, and would potentially connect well with the kinds of things that I think you're interested in with our organization. So certainly having that be a two-way conversation, because you don't want to assume too much, but you also want to be clear about the roles and expectations that you would have with these stakeholder groups. So, you know, whether it's an individual person or a set of people within an organization, you definitely want to be clear about those expectations. I had an example of this just this week. I'm pulling together a committee of people at the University of Montana campus to help build out curriculum for a new major that we are proposing. And as I was reaching out and connecting with people on the campus and in the community to invite them to participate on an advisory committee to develop this new program, I was having, you know, trouble reaching somebody. I didn't want to email her, so I left a phone message because we were just playing phone tag. But I was able to leave a very detailed message about what this committee was for, what the time commitment would be. And when she called me back and left me a message, she said she thanked me. She said, "Thank you for providing such detailed information about the expectations. It really made it easy for me to accept that invitation to participate." So that's just a more recent example I've had as I'm establishing this advisory committee for this new program at the university. So that leads into this next potential option too, is how these people could engage and establish an advisory board. And I believe that's a different CBI session that you'll be talking about here soon, is sort of the steps to do that. But that's a great way to engage people as well. Offering to help them, you know, what can you bring to the table for them as well? How can this be a reciprocal partnership where you're getting something that helps your organization, but in return, your organization is also able to support another type of initiative or connected initiative? So how can you build those reciprocal partnerships? What do they need from you? Maybe they've been considering you as a partner just like you've been considering them, and how can you come to the table and share what those needs look like and how this could be a win-win for both of your organizations. It's also, I think, important to demonstrate the likelihood of success. So be confident about what you're coming in to achieve. You know, people, you know, you don't want to join something that's kind of floundering or doesn't seem like it's realistic to achieve or to attain progress or or be able to see real movement of change. And so I think that's a pretty critical aspect to engaging with your stakeholders too. So inviting them, being very specific about invitation, offering to help them, seeing ways that there can be a reciprocal benefit for this partnership, and also demonstrating that you have confidence in the success of what you're setting out to do. So if you're able to successfully bring on new stakeholders or move stakeholders up into higher levels of engagement within your organization, you know, the possibilities are pretty endless. There's certainly opportunities to reach more people, to have broader impact in your community. If you're looking at fundraising efforts with your stakeholders, you certainly could look at this as an opportunity, as an outcome to raise more money in support of your organization. You can engage more people as volunteers, build up your human resource capacity to meet these critical needs of communities. And hopefully, you know, our end goal with all of our work is really to resolve and eradicate the problems that we're out there trying to address and come up with innovative and effective solutions for. So, you know, I put that out there as the end goal because that's really where a lot of our work is directed. So hopefully it's kind of a way of thinking about working yourselves out of a job, you know, working these organizations out of existence because we've actually, you know, been able to succeed in resolving the problem that they were organized to address in the first place. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and we'll have a few minutes for any questions in the chat box. But you know, really, I hope the session helped you build a better understanding of recognizing, first of all, what a stakeholder is, and how they're important in terms of asserting influence on your organization in a positive and or negative way sometimes. Also looking at the importance of being able to analyze your stakeholders and putting them into groupings of knowing which ones need more attention, which ones need maybe less attention, and how you can manage that strategically within your organization. And also then certainly seeing how you can reach out and engage and move stakeholders along a continuum of deeper engagement with your organization to really help further your goals and objectives. So hopefully it was thought-provoking. Hopefully it created some new ways of thinking about stakeholders and the kinds of important work that you do with them. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for any Q&A, areas where I was not clear or things that, you know, questions that this prompted. We'll give it a couple seconds here for people to think about any comments or questions. And if we don't have any specific questions, another thing that we might want to share now is any things that you've seen as particularly successful impacts of how you've engaged with your stakeholder group. So what have been some of the successes of successful stakeholder engagement? Either questions or examples of successful stakeholder engagement with our last few minutes. All right. A couple of examples. I know they're out there. All right, with my last slide, I'll put up my contact information as well. You can always email me or give me a phone call. I'm always happy to talk with folks more about this. And we have a couple of examples coming through on the chat now. An example would be with me having reached out to different after-school groups here in Missoula and educating them on what we can provide for them and putting together programming to provide the children in these different programs. That's great. So coming up with resources to sort of bolster what organizations are able to do. So for newer folks, yeah, just reaching out and making that initial contact, that's super important. And you know, that's how you really cultivate those relationships. It's just introducing yourself, opening, you know, listening with open ears. At the new stage of stakeholder engagement, you certainly want to be a good listener and understand what their role has been with the organization and what they want to see. All right, another example, often an organization is too hierarchical. It's challenging to reach out to stakeholders. Yeah, that's an important thing to note as well. Are there certain protocols within your organization where you may not have access to your board members? That's certainly an important piece, and thank you for bringing that up here right at the end, because you don't want to overstep your bounds or step on toes. I know at big organizations, there's really strict protocol about approaching donors or reaching out to donors. So you certainly want to understand that protocol within the organization. This is great too, putting yourself in as many different networking opportunities as possible. You never know who you're going to meet and what kind of connections you're going to have. They could be, you know, you could be talking with future donors, future volunteers, future board members. That's great. That's a big part of stakeholder engagement, is really putting yourself out there, talking about your work, and listening to people who you know, might be have connections to the work that you're doing. So again, Montana is a small place. You never know what kind of connections you have with people until you start talking about your work and the kinds of things that you're excited about. It's amazing how that can really create bridges very quickly. All right, well, thanks so much for those examples. I really appreciate your time and attention. Again, I hope this has been a helpful webinar training for you. Like I said, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to continue dialogue or answer questions, troubleshoot, that kind of thing. I'm happy to do. So with that, I think we will see if there's any last questions. We got a couple of minutes. If not, I'll let Callie wrap it up for us. Thank you.
All right, so thanks again, Andrea, for being here with us. We really appreciate it. And for those of you that have not done so already, please enter your name in the chat box for attendance purposes. And I know I didn't send out an email yesterday afternoon. I was still struggling with uploading the video and getting that all taken care of. But today I will be sending out an email to everyone with the slides and the recap of yesterday's session and today's session. So please look for that. And that's it for me. If no one has any other questions, I think we are good with signing off 3 minutes early.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Bye-bye.